All right, happy Tuesday, everybody. Welcome to the fifth installation of the Jumpstarting Business Operations webinar series. I'm Zane Clark, Senior Director of Education at SEMA, also known in its full name as the Specialty Equipment Market Association. We're glad you're with us today. We are in the fifth installment, as I mentioned, and today we will focus on pushing ahead with change while barriers are down. Certainly, we've managed the flip side of this. Now we're looking at a very optimistic side where there might be some additional opportunity. As we always do, we like to kick off each webinar with a few housekeeping items for your benefit and for our amusement. Today's housekeeping items brought to you by SEMA are threefold. Please mute your cell phones, unless, of course, you're using your cell phones to listen to today's webinar, then we would encourage you to keep those on. Please remain seated unless you don't feel like it and you want to get up and walk around. Go ahead and do that. You're probably in your home or your own business, so take the liberty to do that. And no eating during the webinar unless, of course, you are hungry and want to grab a bite to eat. So pretty much do whatever you'd like, just enjoy the webinar itself. On the more technical side of today's housekeeping items, you will notice that you have a nifty little control box on some part of your screen, and it's got a lot of cool functions in it. A couple things that I want to call to your attention. One is the audio button. You may have access to using your computer audio. If you'd like to use your phone audio for a more personal experience, there'll be a number, there'll be an access code, and there'll be a pin. If you can follow steps 1, 2, and 3, you will be in magnificent shape to do just that. You will notice also there is a handouts tab. We have created a PDF version and a Word document version for your viewing pleasure to follow along with today, but certainly as an important and valuable resource following today's webinar that will contain a lot of the content and key points that will be covered. Lastly, there is a questions tab. That is your communication to us. That is your world to have your questions answered. So at any time during today's broadcast, please type in your questions, compliments, feedback, and we will do our best to respond to those at the end portion of today's webinar. So please, we encourage the handout or the questions, and you may get a special shout out if you do, in fact, submit a question. One thing that we're very excited about and proud to partner with the Brain Zooming Group is they have offered up a strategic planning made simple e-course. It's an 11-part series at a $549 value, and we will award that to one of the attendees today at the end of the webinar. So stay tuned for that. That's always an exciting moment that we like to celebrate. All right, let's meet our tour guide for the next 30 minutes, maybe 35, because I'm taking longer than usual, so I apologize about that. But Mike Brown, there he is, the man, the myth, the legend. Mike Brown is the founder and CEO of the Brain Zooming Group. Mike, how are you doing today?
Doing well, Zane. How are you doing?
I am doing excellent, thank you. As I may have mentioned earlier, I'm just enjoying a lukewarm coffee in my nifty SEMA Education mug. Selfless plug there. Please follow us, hashtag SEMA Education. Hey, Mike and I go way back. If you've been on any of these webinars, you've heard me do this spiel now for the 5th time, but first met Mike at a conference to be remain unnamed several years ago. Listen, we don't want to plug any competitors.
But the organizer of that event reached out to me recently, Zane. So I don't know. That's odd. Something's up there. So.
Hey, well, when you give me the green light, I will go ahead and plug that organizer if you're having an appearance there. Yeah, but it was an interesting program. We brought some SEMA volunteer leaders out to some different conferences to get a gauge and identify speakers that we feel would resonate with our audience and that delivered content in a very specific way for small business owners. And overwhelmingly, the group of volunteers at that time said, hey, Mike Brown is the guy. We think he would do really well with our audience. So since then, we've had a long-standing relationship, and we've brought Mike out to both the SEMA and PRI show. and he does really well and always gets great feedback. So we're really excited to have Mike on the call, the webinar. He is also an author, Idea Magnets. Mike, do you have the book?
There it is, right there.
Boom. There it is.
On Amazon.
Yeah, so on Amazon. It's a good book. You know, I've had the chance to go through it, but it certainly does a lot to help leaders cultivate extreme creativity and innovative success. So I highly recommend that book. All right, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the man of the half hour, Mike Brown, founder and CEO of the Brain Zooming Group. Thanks a lot, Mike.
Good deal. Thanks, Zane. Appreciate it. And as Zane said, go ahead and ask questions as we go through here. Would love to customize as much as possible so that we're talking about what's going to be most important to you. And big title for this one. I guess we wrote these titles before we started all these. We probably could have trimmed them down, but at the crux of today's webinar, it's about innovation. And back in webinar 2, we talked about understanding what innovation maybe you'd been able to go through in this time of disruption. The thing that's interesting about innovation and some of the barriers that are in organizations, the barriers to innovation, is the disruption has disrupted those barriers. So we'll talk about what those are, some of the ones that may still be there, and how you can contend with them. As Zane said, my company's called the Brain Zooming Group. We've been around for 10 years, basically helping organizations be better at strategy, be better at innovation, branding, a whole variety of things. Just at the heart of it is to be collaborative and bring a team in so that it's not just 1 or 2 people looking at strategy and making those decisions. And the same kind of thing is in the Strategy for Success e-course. It's the idea that making strategy really accessible to people. So the URL's there if you want to check that out if you don't win one of the courses today. So when it comes to innovation, we like to use a really simple definition to make it accessible to everybody. And that basically innovation is just improving on things that matter. It doesn't have to be technology. It doesn't have to be radically different. It's just we're improving. We're moving ahead on things that are important, that grow the business, that manage costs, that help us to better serve customers. Really, the initial work that I did on innovation was back when I was working for a transportation company. It was a business-to-business company, and for much of the time there wasn't a lot of innovation going on. So a lot of this work that really predated Brain Zooming was not so much about what to do to innovate, but more about the barriers that existed to innovation that I was seeing and trying to contend with. And they basically fell into 3 groups. There were strategy barriers, and those really got to not articulating any kind of a direction for innovation or really being too clinging to the status quo and how we've always done things, or not taking an investment approach, almost being too short term and maybe not even having the numbers in place to know whether you're making progress in innovation. The second set of barriers really dealt with process, and that was maybe there wasn't a process for innovation. It was just, well, if we come up with an idea or if something pops up, we'll do that. Really no push to change things or no resources put behind it, or maybe trying to innovate but just never able to execute and get it out into the marketplace. The third group was people barriers, and that was either not bringing in a broad audience, whether that's employees or customers or maybe other audiences, to contribute to innovation, just sort of viewing it as a couple of people doing it, or there's really no motivation for any employee to step up and take a risk and try and innovate. So those barriers, as we talk to companies now during the 10 years of Brain Zooming, you almost pretty much, if they're struggling with innovation, I can find a place in there where, yeah, they're hitting some of those typical barriers. They've held up really well. Recently, and I've talked about this blast thing that we introduced here really during this whole disruption. It was sort of a quick way to help companies either innovate or look at a situation. And one of the first ones we did was with a nonprofit that I've been involved with. It's probably the longest running Brain Zooming client. And they wanted to understand, why were they being so innovative now when they've been innovative in the past, but things just move so much faster? And the answers we saw fell into those 3 categories. That from a strategy standpoint, they had a good foundation, that they tried to innovate, but they were able to really, because of what they've done, enable new thinking during this time. And they were a lot more focused. A lot of times they had so many things going on. Now they were very focused on survival for the organization and what do we need to innovate to serve our customers. So they had a really good direction. From a process side, they got more nimble, and maybe some of the approvals, trying to be perfect with things, fell away because they were focused on survival, and they were making decisions faster. They were giving people more autonomy. And from a people side, the fact that even though their staff was dispersed all of a sudden, that flexibility signaled to people that they did have maybe more autonomy, or they could run with things more. So it was interesting because of the disruption, some of the barriers that they had, even as a pretty progressive organization, started to fall away. So I'd invite you to think about, and this is in the handout, as Zane mentioned, definitely want to grab this list and think about what innovation barriers are existing in your organization, and maybe still are there, but some of these others in terms of status quo, in not wanting to change, we've all been forced to change. And the fact that right now short term is actually pretty good. Maybe it's not those big home run innovations, it's something small. Let's make progress and be ready to change. From a process side, we've all been pushed to change. You really can't sit back and say, well, I'm going to wait this one out. There's no waiting this disruption out. And I think for a lot of us, for a lot of people, maybe yourself personally or inside your organization, it's like, I have to take risks right now. I can't just sort of stand pat. It may be survival of the organization, it may be career, it may be whatever, but the stakes are high. So this whole thing is talking about these barriers that maybe still remain that weren't disrupted by the disruption. What would you do there? So from a strategy side, how do you best line up things and deal with some of those strategy barriers to innovation? We've talked throughout these webinars about understanding what the new important is, not the new normal, but the new important. And that's really getting to the heart of, as you look ahead now, what is going to be important, what matters. So back to that definition about innovating on what matters. This is really understanding what's going to grow your revenue, what's going to help you improve your business. And as I was thinking through these webinars that we're doing, those may be a pretty good place to start thinking about what the new important is for you. And that's on purpose. When Zane and I first talked about this, we wanted to pick things that were going to be relevant and meaningful for you. But it may be you've got to reshape your brand, or you've got to improve processes. The third one was about managing demand. If you've got sort of peak demand coming back, or the last one was on generating growth. This is a little bit of this is the launch of, I guess, of the cover of the graphic for the next one, which is about adapting experiences, both for customers and employees. You may look at that and say, again, there's a couple of those. That's new important for us. And if so, I'd really encourage you to go back, and if you didn't participate in one of those webinars, go grab the materials. I think they're still out there, and listen to them, because that can give you a head start in articulating that direction for yourself and for the organization. Another thing that's important is to at least have a few metrics in place to gauge what kind of progress you're making on innovation. Now, we actually have clients who have pretty big innovation pushes, and they've tried to stay away from metrics because they didn't want metrics to be a reason for people to not innovate. But we're big advocates that there's at least 3 types of metrics you want to have. Activities, and those are really the first things you do to get started. And that, those happen pretty quickly. Those surface pretty quickly. The second we call indicators, and that's just the reactions to innovation. And the third is returns. And that's where I actually maybe see growth in revenue, or growth in customers, or some cost savings. Those are going to take a while. Those aren't going to be the week after you start innovating. And that's why we recommend these 3. And this actually came from doing a NASCAR program. The company I work for sponsored NASCAR, and it might be a year before we saw revenue gains from people that we brought to events. So we had to explain, hey, we're going to do some things, the activities. We'll see some different types of behaviors from people, the indicators, and then a year from now, we'll be able to compare returns. So think about this whole brain metrics. You don't have to have 50 metrics in here. Maybe it's 3 or 6 or 10 to sort of help you keep a pulse of what's happening, and are you making progress if you're trying to change things. From a process side, the process barriers. As I said before, at times a lot of organizations don't have any type of process for innovation. It's just sort of relying on inspiration here and there. These 4 steps lay out a pretty simple way to start to think about innovation and maybe doing it in a little bit more of a routine fashion. So step one, we've already talked about. That's setting that direction, sharing the new important for your organization and really saying, we want to innovate on that. Innovation's great, but it's about improving the business. Second is look inside the organization and look outside to see what opportunities are out there. Are there challenges that your customers are facing? Are there maybe opportunities to grow that you haven't pursued? And figure out what are the ideas, what are the concepts? And I think we talked about in an earlier webinar, it's not, hey, I've got 2 great ideas, I'm innovating. It may be 50 or 100 ideas, and some of the tools and techniques we've talked about in previous ones will help you come up with that. But have a process to think about on a regular basis. What are the ideas? What things do we maybe want to test out? And that's where step 3, when you get those ideas, prioritize, plan, prototype, pilot, start to move them ahead. It's great to have ideas, but what moves the business is when you actually implement. And as you see what's working, maybe you've got some things out there adapting, you get into step 4, where you're going to launch, monitor, and continue to adapt and really get it out there. So it can be as simple as those 4 steps. It doesn't have to be a complicated process. You just need to get started. In terms of prioritizing and deciding what you're going to do, this is a pretty handy little 4-box grid that we use, and we'll take individual ideas and rate them based on what type of impact we think or an organization thinks they might have, and then how easy are they to do? What's that implementation ease? So if you've got a revolutionary idea, so that's easy to do and it's a big change, those are really easy. You just get started on those, start to put those out there. Things that are maybe easy to do, they're simple to do, but they're evolutionary, those are good near-term tactics. Maybe that's something that you're looking at as you restart and you're getting going. You've got a little bit of a list of those. Things that are maybe revolutionary, they're a big change, but they're a little bit more complex to do. Those may be the things you want to wait on a little bit. They may take some time to do, but maybe now's not the right time to start those. And things that are evolutionary and complex, stay away from those. And you'll see a lot of ideas that come out will fall in there where they're just incremental change and they're sort of a pain to do. There's a lot of steps. There's really no reason to pursue those. This organization I was talking about before was saying, well, we were so focused right now, we got so much done. How do we continue that into the future? And as you all know, you can't operate in crisis mode all the time. You've got to be able to take a pause. But what I recommended to the executive director of that organization is to think about it this way. Take a sprint maybe for 2, 3, 4 weeks where you really try and get everybody focused on doing the same thing and make sure everybody's got a piece of making that innovation happen and maybe put up some posters. And if you have a meeting, always be talking about that. But then take a break from it, take a rest where you pull back. And again, maybe that's for 3, 4 weeks, and then you do another sprint. That's a way to sort of mimic the disruption that we've all gone through right now, where we have to be focused on survival or focus on how do we shut down and restart, but extend that into the future without being in a continual sense of crisis, because that's no way to run a business. One of the things that tends to be a barrier is we don't have any resources for innovation. But really, when it comes down to it, that's about money. It's about time, and it's about expertise or talent to do innovation typically. And after last webinar, we shared a list of ways to think about new marketing ideas. So it was questions to come up with a list of marketing ideas for you. This is a really similar type of approach, and this is in the handout this time. I made sure we had it in there. It's a way to ask these questions to think about how can we free up more resources or think about resources in new and different ways to get a jump start in innovating. So it doesn't always have to be, well, we're pretty strapped right now and our budgets are tight and we've lost money because we were shut down. It can be, how do we reimagine resources or focus on things to free up time or maybe some dollars even to do innovation. And I think with that lower bar definition of innovation that's just about improving things, at times it isn't even involving money. It's just getting some time to think about things and move them ahead. So I encourage you, use these questions. If you can come up with 3 or 4 answers to each one, you're going to have 60, 70 resources to think about innovation. So you can unlock some real possibilities there. Finally, the people barriers. And this is what we describe as how do you get ready to put your people, if you've got a team, put them in the innovation spotlight. And that is not, trust me, it is not probably through an idea box and ask them to put in really fully fleshed out ideas. It is also not getting them in a meeting and say, well, what innovative ideas do you have? What innovations do you have? Because people typically, unless you're an innovation professional or you focus on that, none of us really think that way. Instead, the types of questions you want to ask are, what opportunities do you see to do some new things or do some different things or make some improvements? And that could be really narrowly to what they do. It may be more broadly in the organization. What workarounds maybe have they come up with to deal with processes that don't work, or they see from your customers that have put workarounds together that they hear about? Are there fixes that everybody sort of knows about in the industry or in your business, but you've just never tried those before? Or are there some problems that just won't seem to go away? Those are questions that people can answer, and it's a great way to open up the doors to innovation, to really get them involved and not be put off by, well, I don't have innovative ideas. I don't come up with creative ideas, and take a step back. You want to make it easy for them to participate and really hard not to participate. And another thing you could do is it's really signal how much freedom or how much latitude, if you've got a team, how much freedom do they have to help participate in that innovation? And we came up with this scale a couple of years ago, just internally trying to figure out how we better collaborated. So, an L on the one side is the leader's going to innovate. So if you're the boss, you're going to go figure it out. You're going to come up with the innovation and figure out how it's going to happen. That's possible. It's not something we necessarily recommend as the best way. These others, basically, an LT is the leader's going to start, but quickly involve the team in that. Or C is we're all going to collaborate. Or TL would be the team gets started and then works with the leader. Or maybe it's even a T where you just look at your people and say, you know what, we've got this issue. I trust you. You know really good ideas, really good ways to approach this. You go do it and just bring the solution back to me. Doing something like this, and you don't have to use all five, but just giving your team some sense of here's where we can get started can be really helpful in getting buy-in and ownership for them to participate in innovating. Ultimately, a lot with the people side comes back to this, and this was said by somebody who actually worked for that organization. I didn't think about that, this nonprofit organization I was talking about. We were at a board meeting and talking about some of the things that they were doing. And he said, don't just love old ideas because they've always been done that way. And I think it's easy for us, maybe even if we think we're innovative, to still have those things that, well, I just like doing it that way and it's comfortable and I've always done it that way. And it may be tough to hear from somebody else, to open up that door for them to say, well, there's other ways to do this. Have you thought about this? So I think that's the challenge for how you can use these tools yourself, or how you can open up the doors for your team. That, yeah, there maybe been some ways that we've really been successful with things, but we can't cling to those. And particularly right now, there's a whole bunch of those ways that we've done things that have either been taken off the table by the government, or by expectations from our customers, or we can't get parts, or we can't, supply chain is broken down. We've got to look at different ways. So the whole point of this webinar is think about that as an opportunity, not a challenge, but an opportunity to keep innovating. So takeaways from this webinar are: look at your innovation barriers. What have they been, and which ones aren't as strong maybe as they've been right now, and how can you use that as your platform to innovate? Figure out the new important for you. And that's right now, but it's probably worth asking that new important question in a month, and 2 months, and 3 months, is, maybe you're just getting restarted, because that new important is going to change as you get more experience with what it looks like with customers in these new times. Third, use at least a simple process to innovate, and that can sort of make sure that you do it on a regular basis. And that sprint, rest, sprint can be a great way to say, you know what, we don't have the bandwidth. We don't have enough people and time to take on even 10 different innovations, but let's focus on one and really make an impact with that. I know for us at Brain Zooming, this is one that we're going to try and do a better job of, because we tend to come up with a lot of ideas and we get them started, and then we don't necessarily take them to completion. And finally, third, if you have a team, like I said, make it easy for them to innovate and make it really hard not to. And when I say hard, I don't mean in terms of punishment. I mean making it so easy, making it so inviting that it just, they almost can't resist the possibility of, hey, I can contribute to making the business better and seeing us improve. So we're at about 26, 27, 28 after the hour based on the clock that I look at as I look around the room. But Zane, maybe you want to pop back on if we've had some questions, and we'll try and tackle a few of those before we get out of here for today's webinar.
Yeah, absolutely. Well done, Mike. Go ahead and submit your questions. We have a few in the queue, but we'll be able to get to a few more. Hey, the one thing that really popped out to me on today's webinar was this idea of where you source innovation, that it's not a top-down exercise, and more times than not, some of the best ideas are going to come from multi-layers of staff. So how do you create an environment that's conducive to having people feel comfortable and safe to share those thoughts? So your ask about questions that prompt innovation, the asking about opportunities, workaround fixes, and problems, that seems less daunting, like you said, than just putting people in a room and say, hey, innovate.
Yeah, and you know, one of the phrases I just hate is that, well, we'll start with a blank piece of paper, as if that's really going to be a help. And when you do that, I understand why people say it. You know, there's no boundaries. We can focus on anything. But that puts everything on the participant. They've got to figure out what's important. They've got to figure out for them personally how to generate ideas that works. And again, I spend a heck of a lot of time thinking about that and how it's going to work for other people, but most people don't, because they just don't need to in their jobs. And the thing I tell people, particularly when they go to customers and say, well, what should we be innovating? It's like, that's not your customer's job to tell you what you should be innovating in your business. What you can do with a customer and an employee as well is ask them their experience and their perceptions. And then you need to figure out, as the leader or as the person who's responsible for coming up with new stuff, how do I interpret that, and how do I do that makes the most impact for the business? But you're exactly right. I mean, I just see people so easily shut down when there's a sense of the ideas that I share better be fully formed, and they better be right, because if not, they're going to get shut down right away. Ask people things that they're comfortable with, they're familiar with, and that they think about that are valuable to the business. And you just see so many more possibilities, and people are willing to engage because almost everybody wants to see the business that they work for do better. I mean, yeah, you've got the people who don't, but I think they're few and far between.
Yeah, certainly the terminology that you use will often create a barrier to innovation. And if you ask people to start with a blank slate or a blank piece of paper, sometimes I know personally, I just go blank. So one blank follows the blank. Hey, let's get to some specific questions here. Okay. And the first one comes from V Hill, I think is the name, in San Diego. And the question here is, hey, just listening to your webinar today, Mike, I've identified two key areas where my organization really needs to make a change. But I know I'm going to get pushback from the owner. So this isn't the top L as you identified. This is somebody on the team that wants to push change upwards, but fear they're going to get pushback. It's a small family business. Any suggestions on how that individual can make the case rather than reverting to the status quo?
Yeah, I think maybe is use those questions and maybe you spin them a little bit, but you know, with that owner, with the family owner, to say, well, what opportunities do you see for the business that aren't happening right now? And what frustrates you? Maybe, you know, have you been looking for growth and you don't see that? Or are there ways that you'd like to improve things? Now, you know, an owner may come back thinking about the certain leaders in our country who go, everything's great, everything's fantastic. Then it becomes a little bit more challenging. But I think a lot of business owners, again, if they're particularly making their living out of the business, they're going to be interested in trying to improve things. So I think to understand from them what they think that new important is, maybe you're not setting the new important, but they are, understand and say, well, then go the next step of saying, are there ways that you'd like to see the team help address those things? And by doing that, and I would even document, not like, put a piece of paper in a file, but after a discussion like that, come back to them and say, hey, if I heard you right, you want to try and grow the business more, and you'd be really interested in some of our salespeople maybe participating in that, and use that as that first step to then start to reach out maybe to your salespeople and ask them those questions about, well, what frustrations are you hearing about from customers, or what substitutes, who else are they using because we're not doing something for them? So use those questions, but you're spinning them a little bit to ask them upward in the organization versus outward in the organization.
Yeah, that's great. We had a similar question come in from a longtime friend of mine who is a professional manufacturer's rep, which is a key component of our distribution channel. Vic Bennett was asking a similar question. So I think you kind of got to it in terms of how you kind of slightly nudge customers or vendors to innovate rather than doing business the status quo.
If I can jump in, Zane, a great question to ask customers, particularly if it's more in a business to business kind of setting, is ask them, in your job, where are you spending more time on things than you really want to right now? And where in your job are you not able to spend as much time as you'd like to? The answers to those questions are great ones to go figure out. How could we, if that makes sense for our brand, how could we go free up time for them to focus on what's important, or how can we help them address the important things for them? Again, you're not asking them to come up with your product or your service, but that can give you a really great insight of what you can do to help them be better and what they're trying to accomplish in their business.
All right. We're going to get to one more question, then we are going to announce today's big winner of the e-course and a couple closing announcements before we call it a day. This comes from Nathan in Glendora, and it's really about getting the team to rally around innovation. A lot of people are operating with a fear mindset. So how do you push past the fear to start looking at things differently?
Yeah, and there's obviously even more fear in a lot of organizations right now. In the one I talked about, I think they got around that because there was a tremendous positivity and aspiration already from the leader that we have an important mission going on here. That may be more difficult in a for-profit business. I mean, nonprofits basically operate around their mission. I think it can be helpful to come back and think about what is the bigger purpose that you're trying to do. And it may not just be selling a particular part. If you go back, and I'm trying to think which webinar was it in where we talked about the experience and the brand benefit? I think it was actually the last webinar, number 4, and think about what's that higher benefit that we're providing? And that can maybe take people's minds a little bit away from, oh crap, what's going to happen to my job? Or are we going to close down? Help them tap into that aspiration that's very natural for the business. And then if it's a fear more of, I don't want to take a risk, I don't want to make a change, I may be wrong. You find a lot of people who are very perfectionistic, don't want to share an idea. To help them understand, and it's sort of a pat thing at a brainstorming session to say no idea is a bad idea, but to really create the behaviors that live that out, that you're going to hear and listen and not comment back if you're asking for them, and maybe you have feedback later, but maybe not right then. Give them that target, or maybe you even say, hey, we've thought about a couple of options. What do you think of these options? So let them to react to something instead of having to come up with an idea. And some people, our process is very, let's focus on this right now and let's go really fast. But a lot of people just need time to think. Give those people time to think. That can help them get around that fear as well. So there's a couple of 3-4 ideas that maybe you can take on.
Yeah, that's real helpful, and I think it's you can only control what you can control, and rather than being overwhelmed by the enormity of the situation or the project, how do you kind of at intervals get wins, because that will continue to build confidence and momentum towards that purpose or that mission. So I think it's kind of bite-sized chunks, right? The
Yeah.
elephant in the room, if you will. Thanks everybody, and have a great day.
Bye. Thank you.
See ya.